Welcome to Practically Christian. I'm here with Janelle.
Hi.
And Luke.
Hey guys.
And I'm Jake. And we share conversations that help you know Jesus more deeply and follow him more faithfully. The truth is that no one has arrived at Christ-likeness. To grow in that direction, we believe you need authentic relationships and biblical theology applied to your everyday life. We hope that you are encouraged to grow and to live out the biblical truths that we discuss on this episode. Let's get practical and dive into a conversation about atheism and Christianity and two questions that we received in this kind of realm.
Well, I'm excited, guys, because this is the first time we've actually received a question from a listener, and Lord willing, if our podcast audience grows, I'm sure we won't be able to respond to everyone's question, but we thought, hey, someone submitted a question, they're listening, and so thank you, Isaac, for submitting this really thoughtful question. And basically the nature of the question is this disturbing trend of both Christians who are honestly like hypocrites who are not living the Christian life, as well as a growing number of atheists who are living basically Christian values out in their lives. And so the question is basically what's going on with that? Like, why are there so many Christians who don't live according to the way of Jesus, and then so many atheists who are good when we don't believe that they actually have the truth? So we thought it was a great question. Now the question came in the form of referencing a couple YouTube videos kind of exploring this subject. And so let's kind of work out those YouTube videos and respond to them.
Hey guys, Luke here. We realized after we finished recording this podcast that we forgot something very important. And so as I was sitting here editing, I thought I'd just insert it now, that the links to both of the YouTube videos that we'll be talking about are in the podcast description. And so if you like, you can even pause our podcast here, go and watch those videos, and then watch the rest of this episode, and it might make more sense. If you're watching on YouTube, they'll be in the video description there. But sorry if we forgot to mention that. And after you watch those, you can come back. If you don't want to watch those, we kind of cover enough of the content that you'd be fine anyway. So either way, enjoy the rest of this episode.
Yeah, so the first one that we're going to be talking about was by a woman named Rebecca Watson.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of puts forward this idea overall in the video, basically looking at is religious or non-religious identity more based on rationalism or on emotional arguments or emotional appeal. Mm-hmm. But the Isaac, when he asked the question, was more interested in kind of like the idea of like, are people's religions or non-religions just a product of their parents? And their parents either being strongly goodly religious, where like they're not hypocritical, and so then their kids stay Christian, or the parents being either strong like non-religious but like good, and their kids not being religious, or their kids them being like religious but kind of hypocrites, and their kids going over towards secularism.
Yeah, and I thought it was an interesting video because basically she explores and kind of summarizes the results of this big study that was done that says one of the leading causes of atheism is non-credible religious parents. Do you want to summarize that part of it, Janelle?
Yeah, so basically let's say you were part of a family that went to church maybe regularly or semi-regularly, and at church they are, putting on the front of like, yeah, we agree with all this, we value all this, but then in their home life they don't do anything to help the poor. They don't actually follow their values when they're not under the scrutiny of the religious community. It's kind of like they're pseudo-Christian. And then the child being raised in that home basically is getting mixed messages. They get the message of like, this is really important and this is really true at church. And then in their home life, even though their parents give lip service to those values, they're not living them out. And obviously children see most of what happens in a home. They get that deeper look that isn't necessarily shown to the outside world. So, and to be clear, Rebecca Watson said that in her experience, she was raised Baptist and now she is an atheist. But she said that as a child, she didn't necessarily experience that. Like, she felt like as a child, if you asked her, without any strings attached, are your parents legitimate followers? She would have said yes. So in her case, she wasn't identifying this with her own personal experience of turning to atheism, but she was examining this fascinating study. And I think, this message of hypocrisy driving people away from Christianity has lots of roots in, when I was a kid, did you guys ever listen to DC Talk when you were younger?
Yeah, I know exactly what
There
you're
was
talking about.
a DC Talk song, I think it was What If I Stumble, but the beginning of the intro of the song, they include this quote from Brendan Manning, and it says, I'll read it because I'll get it wrong if I don't, but it says, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." So this is a song from, the 90s?
Yeah.
Probably,
Yeah, the
that
90s.
that I listened to as a kid, and it had that quote in it. And this is basically a study that supports that same idea.
Yeah, but it's interesting because that's a Christian calling Christians out for this trend over 20 years ago. Like, this is not a new trend that Christians are seeing. Yeah. How about the content of the video itself? So that's kind of the big picture of the study she's referencing. Now let's kind of respond to some of those ideas.
So I think there's a couple problems with the way that she went through her reasoning.
Yeah.
Number one was that the study is and has to be a self-reporting of why people did what they did. And I think, as we've seen, regardless of where you are politically, based on the polling system and the idea of how polls have worked since Trump has been running, where they found they actually got much more accurate results if they asked people who they thought their neighbor was going to vote for than who they thought they were going to vote for. And they were actually much more high on Trump, which reflected how many votes he actually got in both of those elections, regardless of when he won or not. That sometimes when you ask people, whether it be an atheist who used to be a Christian, why are you no longer a Christian? Well, in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense to say, oh, my parents didn't follow through on what they said, right? They weren't. But I think she even calls this out in the video where she's like, wasn't my experience, and maybe it's less of a common experience than they reported it as being. But the other side of it is also kind of a retrospect idea of, she kind of put forward a few ideas of how she could see her parents being hypocrites or her community being hypocrites, and they were all examples that basically assumed that she was correct and that the other people were wrong. She was like, and this was made 2 years ago, so she kind of was still on the tail end of the COVID stuff, and she was like, if people didn't get those vaccines, how can you say you're a loving person? And I was like, well, have you asked people what's going on in their brains? Because, they might just be disagreeing with your base facts that getting the vaccine would protect other people. Right? So it's kind of like you can't say that it's entirely hypocritical parents, because those parents might not be hypocritical at all. You just think that they are based on what you think is right and wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, I think there was a lot to agree with in her video, because the beginning of the video is, she said, if someone were to ask me why I'm an atheist, I'd probably just say I've examined different world religions and I've rationally decided that atheism is the more rational solution to questions that people have about ultimate reality. So, but then she kind of went into actually, most atheists say this, but there may be more
Multiple
underlying
reasons,
emotional and relational reasons. And I totally agree with that. And I think that's true not just of people who embrace atheism, but people who embrace any worldview whatsoever. There's rational aspects, but then it's a much bigger and more complicated picture.
Yeah, well, and even you could say to try to pretend that anybody makes a decision for one reason is, I think, a little bit ridiculous, right? And you could say, actually, I think a lot of people begin their journey of looking for truth based on saying, oh, my parents might not have it, whether it be because of their hypocrisy or whatever. But there are plenty of Christians who went on that same journey and then said rationally Christianity makes sense. And there's plenty of people who went on that journey and said rationally I don't think Christianity makes sense. And there are probably plenty of people who didn't have a rational reason as well.
Yeah.
But it's probably most likely like rational and emotional or experiential.
So there's two different videos that Isaac submitted for us to like consider and talk about, and then the way I think of his question is kind of asking two pieces of like, why are so many Christians so hypocritical, and then why are so many atheists so good? So I think let's talk about that second question later, and let's focus on that first one of, let's even just bracket the content of this video for a minute and just explore that question. Like, why are there so many people who claim the name of Jesus and yet their lives look nothing like him? What is going on there? Where's this breaking down?
I think one aspect is that we have a heritage of Christianity. So in a lot of subcultures within the United States, you just identify as Christian because that's what your parents identified as, and that's what your grandparents identified as. That's kind of like the water that you were swimming in. I know when I was a kid, being a Christian was like almost like a respected, expected thing in my small town in Pennsylvania where I lived, where you had automatic credibility if you were a regular church attender. Kind of, it just was culturally advantageous, I want to say, to claim Christianity or to even attend church regularly. I think that is changing. And I think we'll see what happens in the coming years, but I think we're, as a nation, becoming increasingly post-Christian. And as such, I think people will have less motivation to claim Christianity because it brings dishonor on your name as opposed to honor. And so it'll be interesting to see when it may or may not kind of thin out the people who claim Christ, and maybe hopefully that will be more legitimate Christ followers as opposed to people who just claim it because of an inheritance. And as we know, you cannot inherit, like I've heard it said, God has no grandkids. It's like he only has kids. Like you have to be his kid. You can't just say, oh, my parents were his kids, so therefore I have come under my parents' umbrella and I am in God now.
That's actually a very fun quote. God has no grandkids. Yeah, I like that. Anyways, no, I think the other thing is a misunderstanding of the word faith.
Okay.
Right, so in the New Testament, the word faith kind of has a dual meaning. It comes from the Greek word pistis, and it means belief, but it also means allegiance. And so, like, when you swore allegiance to a kingdom, or if your, like, vassal state swore allegiance to a bigger country, you had pistis, you had faith to them. You swore that you would go fight for them, that you would not do anything against them, basically, right? You're now a citizen of that group. And I think we've fallen, especially in American Christianity, at one point there was a lot of a push, and maybe still is, some of like the declare you believe and then you're saved, and very much a just believe and then don't do anything else idea, which kind of loses the idea of what is faith. Faith is allegiance to God and a following through. And it kind of dually gets to the idea of in the book of James, it says, even the demons believe and shudder. Right. I think there's a lot of people who claim Christianity and they believe that God exists, but they don't actually have any allegiance.
Yeah, they think if they got a theological pop quiz and they said, is Jesus the Son of God? Did he die for the sins of the world? And if they mark all those questions correct, then they got an A and they get in, and that's not our understanding of salvation.
That's what I came up with too, as what's part of the problem. Like, we have this big, huge cultural inheritance and assumption of the kind of Enlightenment worldview, right? That you're, what is it, a brain on a stick, yeah. And so your thoughts and your beliefs are what's most important about you. But like the whole invitation of Jesus to a life of discipleship is about following him with your entire life. Like, that was his invitation to his disciples, and that's still what actually discipleship means. It's like apprenticeship in the Jesus way of life. And so, but if you absorb the message that it's just understand these facts and accept them in your mind as true, and that's all it means to be a Christian, then you can get away with saying, yes, those things are true, sure, and now I'm going to live however I want.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, that's, I think, actually where most people start is they get in this place of belief, and now I'm good, and it takes someone to come along and be like, no, there's more. And that's kind of shown in the book of Pilgrim's Progress. If you've read that book, it's about a guy whose name is Christian because the author had a lot of imagination. And he has this burden on his back that's sin, and he gets to the place where it's kind of like a nice like resort hotel in some sense, where he gets like to this place and his burden gets removed, and he like sits down and he's like, wow, this is the life. And one of the guys comes up and goes, oh no, you're not allowed to stay. Like, you got to keep going. Be glad you don't have your burden, because the hard part is yet to come. And so that kind of idea where, in some sense, we can become complacent just in the forgiveness, where we're supposed to move forward, and where God's forgiveness and the gift of the Holy Spirit is not so we can just laze around, but so that we can move forward.
Yeah, the other piece of this, and this will relate to the other video we're going to talk about as well, is actually I've heard an increasing amount of studies that, so pause, like the way studies used to be done is you would self-report and you'd also self-identify. So, have you ever been divorced, and what's your family life, etc., and what is your religious cultural identity, and you just say, I'm a Christian, and you go on. And so I think part of the problem in some of these statistics is that that's the way studies were done and have been done for quite a while. And like Janelle, you were sharing that for a long time, like Christianity in our culture was almost the default position of like, well, I'm not one of these other things, therefore I'm a Christian. Or I'm not totally convinced atheism is true, so I'll say Christian. Like that's like was almost the default. But now I'm hearing about more and more studies that actually, instead of asking you to self-identify, they do that for you by asking about your behaviors. So, do you attend a church regularly, at least twice a month? Do you, and fill in like the practices of Christians, and then they'll do the study. And what's interesting is they're increasingly finding that like, and you read a book that references Janelle, so you might want to talk more about it, that there is actually, like for example, the divorce rate is one that's come up, right? The divorce rate among Christians and non-Christians is virtually the same. I don't know if you've ever heard that statistic. But now that they've started looking at what do your behaviors say about you, they actually say that among practicing Christians, the divorce rate is way lower. But among people who claim Christianity but have no markers of Christian behavior otherwise, the divorce rate is so far worse that when you put those two groups together, it's the same as outside culture, right? Do you want to speak more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the stuff in front of me, but I just know, I think it was about abuse and kind of like domineering husbands is higher among people who claim Christianity but don't practice Christianity. So there's like a gap but it was about kind of like a women's rights type study, but among marriages in practicing Christian families, there is much lower abuse and domineering. Like there's much more love and care, basically, and not just like, I'm the husband, so this is what you have to do and do whatever I want, So it was just interesting because that distinction, I think, is something that we want to have in studies. As practicing Christians, we don't recognize as our church body people who are just claiming it and never doing anything about it or feel like they're a good person and they maybe say grace before Thanksgiving dinner, like those aren't our church body, so we don't.
Yeah. Well, I think the easiest statistic that kind of shows the that divide between people who are practicing Christians and not is the statistic that's, I think it's about 90% of Christian marriages where they don't have sex before marriage, they succeed. And it's just like one kind of statistic, and that statistic allows that people have had sex beforehand, but just not with the person that they got married to. And those people are 90% likely to not get a divorce, which I think probably is maybe the easiest like one statistic to go. where are you actually practicing at the moment of your marriage, and where does that lead?
Yeah, so the last thing let's discuss from this first video, and then we'll tie up some of the loose ends later, but is how about you, like personally for you? Because her whole context was that one of the biggest drivers of atheism is the credibility of your parents and your kind of parent faith community. So for you guys, did you have credible witnesses and examples? And how did that affect your Christian life and walk?
Yeah, I think my mom said something to me, and I don't actually know if I've talked about it on the podcast before. She said something to me a while ago that was really interesting to me. She was like, she said that her family, and like from basically her grandfather to me, was the opposite of a family losing faith over time. And she said that so my great-grandfather was a staunch atheist. Her mom, so my grandmother, would drop my mom and her siblings off at Sunday school and church on Sunday morning so that she could go get a perm and have enough time to go get her hair done.
Free childcare, basically.
Free childcare, and then she'd come pick them up after church. And then my mom kind of was in the position where we were we attended church at some points, and at some points we didn't. And then I'm kind of like all in and am like on a pastoral staff, and so it was kind of like the funny opposite, where each generation was like one step closer to following Christ more fully. And I think like my mom is definitely like a faithful person, but it is kind of like funny to see like that, where I think I had a good influence from my mom, and my mom was very open to Christianity, but we were in some sense a family that was a little bit more faithful than we actually were church attenders. And it kind of went in that direction.
Yeah, my parents were good examples of Christian witness. I would say my dad was a pastor, and I know a lot of pastors' kids have awful stories about how their home life did not match up with their public life, but that was not my experience. I have memories of my parents were foster parents for a while. They ministered in various ways in their community. They loved people well, like they loved us as kids well. I remember my dad apologizing when he screwed something up, and like being repentant before his children, like humbling himself. You know, like it's just things like that where it wasn't the experience that I know a lot of people have had, and I feel for those people. Because if you have your Christianity mixed up with this horrible witness, it can be a hard thing to separate. And yet I know God can do that. I actually was very encouraged. Just recently I talked to someone who was raised in a very messed up Christian community, very wrong, like cultic community that claimed Christianity, and she's following Jesus. And I'm like, how did you not just run to atheism from that horrible place? But God saved her. He can save anybody, and He can cut through the evil that people experience, whether it's in an atheist home or a faith-based home.
Yeah, no, I'm similar to you, Janelle. Like my parents are strong followers of Jesus, and I still have memories of like waking up in the early morning. I was a really early riser kid, but seeing my parents just sitting together reading their Bibles in the morning, and I think that impacted my understanding of what it means to follow Jesus and looks like, and went to church regularly and prayed regularly. And so why I asked that question, what I was thinking about is just going back to that study of like the credibility of your parents and your faith community, how that affects you. And I do have to admit and think that like one of the many reasons I think I am a Christian is because of that credible witness that my parents provided. And so, in the nature of being like practically Christian, if you're a Christian and you have kids, like your influence on your kids does matter. Like your job is to disciple them in the faith. And I've come across this idea recently about how discipleship is not optional, or spiritual formation isn't optional, right? Everything that we are exposed to forms us in one way or another. And so the optional part is whether you're being formed in the direction of Christ-likeness or in the direction of the world. And so just like an encouragement to you parents you should be faithful to Jesus, period. Right? Like, hopefully. But also that really does affect your kids and them following Jesus and what that looks like and the kind of questions they're going to ask and struggle with. And we know that God has no grandkids. Like, those kids will have to make their own decision. But it's kind of like you can give them a leg up or handicap them in some ways is how I think of it.
I think and Janelle kind of touched on this when she was talking about her story, is that I think probably the biggest indicator is actually related to how people come to Christ, where Jesus says you have to be like a little child, and he's making that mention because he's saying you have to come humbly to God. And so I think it's very much a parent that is going to influence their kids towards Christ are parents that humble themselves to God and humble themselves to their children, and teach their kids not all of the right words to say, but to act humbly.
Yeah.
I think that kind of like is the connection.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And actually that relates to the second video we're going to talk about pretty well, too. The humility. Jake aside, because there was some aspects of the second video that felt like unfair argumentation, and
I'll say this. This is, and I think this happens a lot when, as a youth pastor, people bring different videos, or I'll see different videos, or even within Christian denomination, like arguing videos or arguments. Something I've learned over time to watch out for, as someone who really likes good arguments, is to notice when someone is making a strong argument versus when they're arguing strongly. Because the guy, it was Planet
Curious.
Planet Curious.
And Phil Zuckerman. Yeah.
Sounded like he had a very strong argument in that video. And I listened to it and paused about every 7 seconds to write down a problem with it. I'm going to try to be very gracious, but it was a bad argument.
So the second video was by Phil Zuckerman, and it was basically an exploration of trying to argue against the common viewpoint that Christians and religious people are better or morally superior to atheists. And so his whole video is basically trying to make a case that that's actually is the opposite, that atheists and secularists are actually far and away better people overall and more moral than religious people are. That was his basic argument, and now we can kind of explore how he went about creating that case and some of the issues. Yeah. Some of them, not all of them.
Yeah.
We don't have that much time.
So I would say the first thing to distinguish is he wasn't necessarily arguing for all atheists. He limited it to a subset of atheists that he labels secular humanists. And then he said something like, for every like Mother Teresa that you can find who's motivated by religious reasons for her, good works and moral vision, you can find, and then he would name a secular humanist that he finds admirable, and basically saying like the good works that religious people do are matched in every way by secular humanists. And then he goes on to explore different values or areas, and say on caring about climate change, secular humanists are better. On caring about women's reproductive rights, secular humanists are better. On caring about, and then he just went through different areas and basically said, in all of these areas, secular humanists win. The end, kind of, that'd be my summary.
Yep.
Would you guys add anything to that?
No, that's a gracious way to put it. I think number one, what we talked about with the last video, kind of is one of the problems with the studies that he was kind of putting forth and using, where it was like it's based on self-reporting, and maybe the Christian sample isn't really an honest Christian sample. But also the other problem is if you think about it, it doesn't make much sense to argue atheism versus religion, because every religion claims that all of the other religions are wrong. And so if a religion's argument is correct, let's say theoretically, Christianity is correct, it would make less than 0 sense to combine Muslims who would be then wrong, Jewish people who would then be wrong, Buddhist people who would then be wrong, and Christians who are right against a group that would be wrong. Like you would have to compare secular humanism to each group individually for it to make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, that was the first thing I noticed. It was that he was like just grouping all religions together, and like as a Christian, like there are some redeemable good things in a lot of religions, because I do think God like set eternity in our hearts, and so that there is, I think, a religious instinct, and there are some good things in each culture and even in some religion. But overall, if it's not focused on Jesus, it's not actually really good. And there's going to be some idolatry there too, or like thinking about the Old Testament worship that we do know very clearly about. Like idolatry takes the shape of all kinds of unhealthy things, like even child sacrifice, right? So just to group it all together, I agree, sets it up in a false way that's like.
Yeah, in a very obvious example, the one that kind of stood out to me the most, that kind of had a multi-tiered area, was like when it came to, he brought up the word patriarchy. It's like, as a Christian, I believe there is a difference between men and women, and I do think that there is, from my vantage point, some kind of authority difference between men and women. Not that they're unequal, but that they have differences and different callings. And yet I would condemn Muslim views of men and women. And so there's obviously more here than a binary religious versus non-religious.
Yeah. I guess we're just going to list all the issues we had the video, and then we'll engage with the content idea. So what other problems do you have with?
The other big problem was that he made a lot of presuppositional arguments, which was basically my views are the moral views, and secular humanists agree with my views, thus they are more moral. Which, when you phrase it like that, you can see how it becomes a very poor argument very quickly.
It's circular reasoning.
Because if you applied it from a Christian point of view, you could say, as a Christian, I believe that name your issue.
Abortion is wrong.
Abortion is wrong, and then...
And if you do a comparison study, more Christians than non-Christians believe that abortion is wrong. So therefore, Christians are superior.
Morally. Yeah, so it's just like, that doesn't work as reasoning, because you're presupposing your value and then applying. And all the values that he listed, I would say, are essentially aligned with the left. And I know that there are Christians who are both left and right on the political spectrum, but it was basically like all of the values that we're going to evaluate are on the left.
Yeah, he even did some, I would say, like, unfair labeling or associating, like...
Yes, well, we have, on racism, which we would then have to say, like, what do you mean by racism? Because if you mean against white people, you would say, wow, then maybe the left would be incorrect on that, versus any other sort of thing. He talks about climate change, and I think fairly says that there are a lot of religious people who deny that climate change is like actually happening in a negative way. But that doesn't mean that they're like evil for not wanting to do something about something they don't believe is happening.
Yeah, if those people genuinely believe that
he went to homophobia.
Yeah, which he immediately equated with equal rights of marriage for gay people, which is not what homophobia means. Homophobia means being scared of people who identify as gay, or like
or
unable
so
to
against
associate.
so against them that
which
you
is
won't
a different thing. Like,
interact.
I agree homophobia is wrong, but that does not mean
that you agree with homosexual
and
thriving or something.
that leads to thriving.
So there were. Do you want me to? I list them all because I wrote them all down. But you don't have to.
No, it's okay. Maybe just any that stand out as just like unfair. I want to say argumentation.
I think. And this is the weird one to me was the death penalty.
Okay.
Because Christians are so divided on that.
They are, yeah.
And I think it is one of the ones where we show how much blending all the religions together wouldn't make any sense, because Buddhists, as far as I understand Buddhism, would be very against the death penalty, and Muslims would be very for the death penalty, and Christians are very divided on the death penalty. So, like, it's obviously not a monolithic group.
Yeah, I think the one that stood out to me is the abortion one, because he talked about it as if the anti-abortion people, the pro-life people, have no moral reason why they have that view. And I'm like, they have a very strong moral reason. They believe that you're killing babies when you abort a fetus. So to just totally disregard their worldview and not even engage with what they're morally saying, I felt was like a pretty unfair approach. Just to only take the reproductive rights and not the baby's rights into account. It just I want to say it glossed over the whole worldview debate that's there and just said they're wrong.
Yeah.
And they have no reason to be. Like, it didn't even allow them a voice to say there's a reason why they morally think that abortion is wrong, and not just that they disagree with women's rights or something is essentially what he said.
Yeah, which even gets at, even within the view he was presenting, right? He said, like, what makes something right or wrong? And his view is that it's related to compassion and empathy and what causes suffering or not. But if you use that rubric, like, that is the Christian reasoning or the anti-abortion reasoning. For basically all of those things. Yeah, it's like, no, we believe that by not living God's way, you are causing suffering to yourself and others. And that's why we're motivated out of love and compassion to tell you to stop or to push for change.
But I will say, I think the impression, like, if you were to interview people on the street and get their cultural view of Christians, and again, they're probably including a lot of Christians who claim it and don't actually live that way. They would probably agree that the Christians seem to be uncompassionate. They're abrasive. They're just fighting. They're culture wars, and they're not actually caring about the people and the situation. So I think, if you came from that viewpoint, a lot of his stuff probably would hit a little bit differently than, feeling like you're
being attacked and don't understand our side.
So can we transition from the video to the question and kind of like play with the idea a little bit?
Although one more point before we do that is that unlike Rebecca Watson's video, where she actually referenced a particular study that was done, I didn't see anywhere in his video description or verbally quoted that he referenced any studies. Like, maybe he is, but in the video they were just all assertions that atheists are better in all of these areas than religious people are, and I didn't see evidence for that. And just looking at even historical evidence, like, we know that the 20th century was like the bloodiest in history, and not at the hands of religions, it was at the hands of secular governments, right? Like
the communists in Russia, who were patently and very like over-the-top atheist, the Germans in World War II, who had a tiny claim to Lutheranism, kind of, but it was Lutheranism that denied the divinity of Christ, so not really Christian, and the Chinese in their revolution, which was patently Confucius and atheist. And those, I think, are the three biggest atrocities going on.
Yeah, I will say, I think from the beginning of the video, when he said, I'm talking about secular humanism instead of atheism, you can just declaim anything that you don't want to own. And I feel like that's an unfair way to argue, too, because you're basically, it would be as if, as a Christian, if I were arguing, I said, I'm only considering people who give 10% or more of their income to religious causes. And, it's like, that's a small subset of a much larger, group. And so I feel like the limiting that he did on bringing it down to, and then he can just say, well, they don't line up with my version of secular humanism, so they are off.
No, someone who's more critical might say, didn't you guys just do the same thing but with Christianity? How would you respond?
Yeah, I would say that, and it's actually in some ways a little bit more fair for us to do, because if we say that there is a truth claim that you have to accept to be a Christian, then that's your that's the limiting factor, is you are not a Christian unless you've made this truth claim. But secular humanism / atheism doesn't really have a truth claim where you can like an orthodoxy or a measuring stick to measure it by. But I do think it's and maybe you, I think, could make a fair argument of secular humanism, but then you wouldn't be able to compare that to all religions. Like that, it's an unfair comparison that he's making. So if he wants to limit it, he needs to limit it vice versa,
right? Not
limit it on one side. And I think we can. I would say we could make a compelling case regardless of the morality of Christians, of strong even if of Christians who accept the truth claim that Christ is God and I have allegiance to Him, over the best of atheism and secular humanism. I think that's a fair case to make, which we can if we want.
No. Let's go ahead and we're going a little long, but it's a good question, and I want to make sure we explore it and answer it completely. So to your point, Jake, let's dig in and almost like, okay, now that we've kind of hashed out all our problems with how you presented, it is true that you can be an atheist or a secularist and a generally moral, good person, or do a lot of the things that even we would agree with. These are good things. These are compassion and service-oriented and loving actions. So what's going on there? Why are so many atheists
I think
so good?
The first thing to think about would be that secular humanism is a uniquely Western idea. There is no secular humanism in China. And the reason that is because there's no Christian influence in China. And so I think secular humanists are swimming in the water of Christian influence, whether they know it or not. And the easiest way to see this is the fact that he brings up empathy, and in some sense kind of gets at this idea, compassion, and I think that kind of goes along with charity, where charity and compassion in the Roman Empire, the pre-Christian Roman Empire, was considered weakness. It's considered wrong. And so even saying, oh, well, we're going to use the measuring stick of compassion and charity is to say, we are actually using a Christian measuring stick, and if we didn't have this influence, we would actually find this a negative thing in our culture.
Yeah, and I haven't read the whole book. I know it's a big one, but Tom Holland, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, but the historian Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion. I think it's Dominion? I think so, pretty sure. Where it's not written from a Christian perspective, he's just writing as a historian, but it's basically like he came to the conclusion that like, wow, Christianity has done so much good for the world by instilling these values that would not exist without the spread of Christian ideas and culture and the teachings of Jesus.
And just to reference a previous podcast when we did our political discussion of progressivism, we talked a little bit about how sometimes non-Christians will take a certain value from Christianity, but then they put it on its own pedestal.
They make it an idol.
And make it an idol. And then it can morph from what it was intended to be. So for instance, if you were to take compassion and you just say, we have compassion, and then in the abortion debate, we would say they're applying it to only one of the people involved in the picture. So you're having compassion for the woman and compassion for the situation that she's experiencing, and no compassion for the child who is being killed. So I think a Christian compassion has to include all the people in the picture, whereas it's easier if you're divorcing it from Christian values. You can just say, well, we're going to have compassion for this. Or the same thing with the racism debate. You can say, we're going to have compassion for the victim, and then if you only identify one side as a possible victim, then all of your compassion is going to be focused in a way that's actually not compassionate to all of the neighbors involved. And it can like kind of do that swing, from being like, this isn't fair, so we're going to be unfair back, and almost a revenge mentality instead of a balanced.
Yeah, I think the other thing going on there is it becomes more feelings-based how you do that moral, right? It's I'm going to be compassionate towards the person I feel the most for in this moment.
I see.
I'm going to be loving towards the person I feel the most for in this moment. I'm going to prevent suffering for the person I feel the most for in this moment. And I think that comes out a lot. Like one of the ones he brought up was the death penalty. He's going to cause the least amount of suffering towards the person he's focused on, which is, now that the trial is over, the person who's on death row. And so it can like kind of just be very focused on individual circumstance, like just kind of like kind of have blinders on, where it's like I just need to do this one moral or these two morals, but wherever I'm looking right now without thinking about everything else going on.
Now I will say, like, to the overall point, like, and I do think Christianity has room to say, no, you can be good without God.
You can take moral actions.
Yeah, you can take moral actions. Like, you have responsibility as a human, and the law, God created us with consciences that are formed by culture, yes, but like there's also good within culture. Like it's not the case that Christians say, every single thing about culture is bad and wrong, and only within the church is any goodness to be found. And,
but I think by default, sometimes people get that message that, like I remember, I went to a training for Muslim missionaries, and one of the things that the trainer was telling these Christians, they were faithful Christians who want to be missionaries to Muslim nations, he had to say, there are wonderful, hospitable, lovely, welcoming, generous people that you're going to meet, because a lot of missionaries actually thinking they're going into these like hard places almost have this attitude of like, I'm going to meet a bunch of terrorists and then I'm going to change their hearts for Jesus is kind of like their attitude. And he was like, you're going to be disillusioned really quick, and you're going to think that your worldview might be totally wrong, like as a Christian, if that's the attitude you go with. But I do think a lot of times like Christians have this attitude of like goodness only comes from Christians, and I think it's not biblically supported. There's this common grace and this
so God rains blessings upon everyone.
Yeah, but I think sometimes people are shocked and they just don't even know, or it's like a different way of questioning their worldview and their Christianity if they come across people who are morally superior in some sense and follow a different religion or an anti-religion in the case of atheism.
And the final thing I'll say is like, I think there's not enough, and I don't know how you could even do this study, but I don't think there's enough attention given to the starting point of people. Because, like, going back to the words of Jesus, right, when he says, like, like he's sitting there with, it was with Levi, the tax collector, right? And if you just look at Levi's good works and his righteousness level and his level of morality, according to the standard of his day, versus, the average Pharisee in his day, it'd be like, big difference here, right? Who's better, the Pharisees or Levi? But then Jesus comes along, he's like, it's not the righteous who need a doctor, but the sick. Like, that's who I've come for. And so, and there isn't like this microwave instant transformation. Oh, well, there is instant transformation in your heart, but then there's this life of following Jesus, of apprenticing under him, and that is this slow process and journey of becoming more like him. And so, I do think it'd be really fascinating, I don't think it's even possible, but to look at like the starting point of the average Christian, like the kind of level of morality they had before following Jesus and where they are now versus like the average atheist. I just have this sense that a lot of the good atheists out there were probably raised in really healthy homes and things like that, where like they had
Christian influence.
Yeah, they had Christian influences in certain ways, or just good influences, and kind of the whole like we're all sitting on the shoulders of giants kind of thing, like where they maybe have a leg up that they don't even realize. All right, so for the get to know you type question, what is one of your biggest influences? And I mean, this is like a person. And it can't be Jesus, okay, besides Jesus.
I just immediately, so there's an old YouTube video which everyone should go look up called Ignatius, the Ultimate Youth Pastor. And at one point they ask, well, who's your biggest influences? And he goes, Bono for one. And then he goes, C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia films. So good. Hope he writes another one. and that's all I can think of.
Yeah, that was a parody satire on the cool youth pastor who doesn't know anything.
I think my I mean, I have a lot of influences. My biggest intellectual influence, at least starting out, when I kind of like was taking my faith on my own, or for my like where I was kind of like taking hold of it for myself, was G.K. Chesterton, because. And actually goes back to one of my other greatest influences, which is Adventures in Odyssey, because at one point they mentioned that a G.K. Chesterton book is what leads to Mr. Whitaker becoming a Christian, and so then I read the G.K. Chesterton book that he referenced, and it was what made me decide to go to a Christian college, and so amazing. And onwards and forwards. But just actually, in some ways, hearing as he was writing, like hearing his like intellect and him deeply engaging with questions in kind of a weirdly like mix of emotional / intellectual way, where he like didn't shut off his emotions entirely, and he also didn't like turn away from the intellectual side. He was able to like kind of balance those things really well.
He's pretty good at making fun of bad arguments, which probably went right to your heart.
Very good at making fun of bad arguments. He was also like 360 pounds and 6'10" in 1915. So he was a very unique person. But I really appreciated him and some of the ways that he talked about culture, and the way he addressed a lot of the change that was going on in England at the time, where he was able to kind of like, I mean, one of the greatest things that he talked about was, he said, when you want to change a law, I'm all with you as soon as you tell me why that law was put in place in the first place. Because you don't know what you're going to break if you don't know what it does or why it was put there in the first place. But kind of just like that whole way of thinking behind issues, and what they're going to affect. I think it's really cool.
That's cool. I like it. Janelle?
I'm going to go with just like a personal, but I think my parents, like hearkening back to our earlier conversation, like I feel like they're by far and away the most formative people or influences in my life. How about you?
Yeah. Well, now I feel like I have to say my parents because, you know.
I feel like I should say Ed Black.
What came to mind actually was our Introduction to Christian Theology. That was a required course because Janelle and I went to a Christian college, so everyone had to take it. And our professor was a brilliant guy named Telford Work. And just the way he taught was like, I basically, like, the way I describe it is like my Christian faith. Like, he kind of like separated out all the pieces of it that I had just been given and received and be like, look, these ones are unbiblical, and then help me put it back together. And like it was very significant for my journey of following Jesus and my passion for study going along with understanding Jesus better and following him more closely. So that's what I would say. You're just smiling at me.
I love it. It's great. I was in that class with Lucy.
Yeah, we were in that class together before we were dating. But still, a little bit of flirting on Janelle's side.
I had my sights on this guy right here.
Well, now with that all out there, who wants to close us in prayer for this episode?
I will.
Thanks.
God, we pray for these listeners and honestly for Rebecca Watson and
Phil Zuckerman.
And I just pray that you would continue to work and to show yourself, Lord, and to help us to understand you I know we'll never do that completely, but just in true ways, Lord. And I pray that you'd help us to be honest about our own hypocrisy that we exhibit in our own lives, and that we would address that with repentance. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen.